Hello, I'm Maria Titizian.
And I'm Rubina Margosian, and this is the Week in Review.
Every week, we bring you the stories shaping Armenia and the region.
From politics and policy to social issues and conflict, we break down the news and what it means for you.
This week in the news, Armenia and Germany signed joint declaration on a new strategic agenda for bilateral partnership. Yerevan and Baku begin talks on potential export of Azerbaijani fuel to Armenia. And Pashinyan proposes a joint roadmap with Azerbaijan to close two issues, the return of Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh and Baku's so-called Western Azerbaijan narrative. These stories and more in our weekly roundup of the news.
Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has wrapped up a high-profile visit to Germany, capped by the signing of joint declaration on a new strategic agenda for bilateral partnership with Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The non-binding document signals a significant deepening of political and economic ties and endorses Armenia's closer integration with the European Union. It lays out plans for expanding cooperation across trade and investment, energy, digital transformation, security and cybersecurity, as well as education, science, culture, and people-to-people exchanges. The Armenian Prime Minister and the German Chancellor stressed the importance of unblocking regional transport links, with Pashinyan promoting Armenia's Crossroads of Peace project as a vital node in the Middle Corridor. Speaking at the German Council of Foreign Affairs, Pashinyan announced that a new Armenia-American joint venture, TRIP company, will be registered in Armenia and granted rights to develop major transport and energy infrastructure, including railways, highways, oil and gas pipelines, and fiber optic networks. He said construction could begin as early as next year, adding that TRIP, together with potential openings of communications between Armenia and Turkey, could become a crucial component of the Middle Corridor linking Europe, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia.
And speaking of TRIP, the US and Armenia have taken new steps toward implementing the major infrastructure and connectivity plans outlined in the recent agreement and memorandum of understanding. A number of MOUs actually signed in Washington back in August. Speaking at the American Chamber of Commerce in Yerevan, U.S. Ambassador Kristina Kvian said Washington and Yerevan are now working with the Armenian government to establish the structures that will oversee both initiatives. She confirmed that two intergovernmental working groups have been formed to guide implementation, and they will hold their first meeting before the end of the year. Kvian also said the two governments are finalizing the legal framework for a new joint entity that will manage TRIP's planning and construction. And this is what Pashinyan said in Germany, as Rubina said. The ambassador described the August 8 Peace Summit in Washington as an inflection point in U.S.-Armenia relations, saying the commitments made by Armenia and Azerbaijani leaders toward peace should ease public fears and signal to global investors that Armenia offers a stable and growing business environment. Separately, a delegation from the U.S. European Command visited Armenia this week, led by Brigadier General Chris McKinney. The group met with Armenia's Ministries of Internal Affairs and Defense as part of efforts to support the Washington Accords. EUCOM said cooperation will focus on sustaining peace, including strengthened chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense, as well as continued military modernization.
And Armenia and Azerbaijan have begun talks on the potential export of Azerbaijani oil and petroleum products to Armenia. Discussions described as unprecedented by Azerbaijani presidential aide Hikmat Hajiev at an international forum in Doha. He said the issue was raised during the November 28 meeting between the deputy prime ministers of the two countries, which focuses on border delimitation. Georgia's Ministry of Economy announced it will allow a one-off free-of-charge transit of Azerbaijani fuel to Armenia. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze instructed Georgian railways to transport the shipment without payment, calling Georgia a strategic and reliable partner to both countries and underscoring Tbilisi's support for regional peace and cooperation. Armenia's Economy Minister Gevorg Papoyan confirmed the arrangement, describing Georgia's decision as a gesture towards the peace process. He declined, however, to specify when the first shipment will arrive. Armenia's Deputy Prime Minister Meher Grigoryan added that any long-term supply deals will be conducted by private exporters and importers on commercial terms. Armenia currently sources roughly 90% of its petroleum and diesel from Russia under Eurasian Economic Union preferences that waive export duties.
Last week, we spoke about the newly adopted Armenia-EU Strategic Partnership Agenda. This week, Azerbaijan's foreign ministry criticized the deal, claiming it runs counter to the Armenia-Azerbaijan Azerbaijan peace process. In a statement, Baku condemned the document's use of the phrase, quote, Karabakh Armenians who became refugees after Azerbaijan's military operations, arguing that those who moved to Armenia did so voluntarily after rejecting Azerbaijan's reintegration plan. It said classifying them as refugees reflects a biased attitude toward Baku. The ministry, this is the Azerbaijani ministry, also criticized references to the full implementation of International Court of Justice rulings. Baku further denounced Armenians held in Azerbaijani prisons being described as captured persons and objected to the absence of any reference to the TRIP connectivity project. Instead, it noted the inclusion of Armenia's Crossroads of Peace initiative, which it said lacks regional consensus. Another point of contention was the EU monitoring mission in Armenia. Azerbaijan argued that under a preliminary agreement barring the deployment of third-party representatives along the border, EUMA's continued presence is problematic. It accused Yerevan and Brussels of prioritizing the mission rather than winding down its activities. The ministry concluded that the document's emphasis on defense cooperation contributes to what it described as Armenia's militarization. Armenia's foreign ministry rejected the criticism. Spokesperson Ani Badalian said the strategic partnership agenda reflects deepening values-based cooperation between Armenia and the EU and supports Armenia's sovereignty, territorial integrity, democratic development, and socio-economic resilience. She stressed that the agenda contributes to efforts to consolidate regional peace.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan told reporters in Germany that he has proposed developing a joint roadmap with Azerbaijan to simultaneously close two contentious issues, the return of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and Baku's so-called Western Azerbaijan narrative. Pashinyan said Azerbaijan continues to advance the Western Azerbaijan discourse while at the same time objecting to the Armenia-EU document's reference to Karabakh Armenians who became refugees after Azerbaijan's military operation. So he reiterated that the return of Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians is not a realistic prospect, warning that pursuing such an agenda would effectively restart the Karabakh movement, which he said has come to an end. Pashinyan added that Azerbaijan's continued use of Western Azerbaijan terminology also creates concerns in Armenia, saying both sides need to understand the roots of these narratives and work towards removing them through a jointly agreed roadmap. However, Artsak's exiled authorities this week reaffirmed that the people of Artsakh are not prepared to give up their collective right to return to Nagorno-Karabakh. The announcement came during parliamentary hearings held at the Artsakh representation in Yerevan on the occasion of Artsakh's Constitution Day. Ashot Danielian, Speaker of the Artsakh National Assembly and acting president, said their primary goal remains securing the rights of the people of Artsakh returning to their homeland, living there safely, and determining their political status on the basis of self-determination. Danielian said the hearings marked the opening of a new chapter in their struggle, though he did not specify what actions may follow. He added that a return would only be possible under international security guarantees.
And one day after those hearings, Armenia's investigative committee conducted a search at the Artsakh representation. Now, this representation has been there for
decades,
always. Yeah. Just so people understand, when we talk about it's a physical building where the committee confirmed that the search was carried out within the framework of an ongoing criminal case. According to the Artsakh representation's lawyer, Roman Yerevan, the criminal case was opened back in June of this year and concerns an alleged crime involving a transfer of rights agreement that was concluded by the Artsakh Investment Fund as part of a loan contract with a bank operating in Armenia. Yerevan noted that the agreement had been approved by both the Armenian and former Artsakh governments and said he sees no obvious criminal elements in the case. Yerevan said it remains unclear what specific documents investigators were seeking. The court decision authorizing the search also references the ongoing criminal prosecution of Samvel Garabedian and testimony he reportedly provided during the preliminary investigation. The lawyer said he has no information about the content of that testimony, which is strange if he's, representing the Artsakh side. Nonetheless, this is a story that we will obviously be following.
And Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan traveled to Moscow this week from Germany to attend a meeting of the Eurasian Intergovernmental Council, where he reaffirmed Armenia's commitment to cooperation within the Eurasian Economic Union while continuing to pursue closer ties with the European Union. Speaking at the Council's expanded session, Pashinyan emphasized the importance Armenia places on expanding the EAEU's external economic relations, describing this as a key factor in strengthening the bloc's role in the global economy. He highlighted the conclusion of new free trade agreements, cooperation in transport and logistics, and the diversification of transport infrastructure as drivers of economic growth. Pashinyan also welcomed Azerbaijan's decision to unblock the transit of goods to Armenia through Azerbaijani territory, calling it an important achievement for regional peace and stability. But just days earlier, speaking to journalists in Hamburg, Pashinyan had addressed Armenia's long-term strategic direction, stating that while leaving the Eurasian Economic Union is not an objective for his government, joining the European Union is. He acknowledged that simultaneous membership to both blocs is not possible, but said Armenia has not yet reached a point where a choice must be made. Meanwhile, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Uverchuk once again reminded Yerevan that Armenia's membership in the EU and the EAEU would be incompatible and that at some stage Armenia would have to make a choice. Uverchuk said the decision, however, should be made by the Armenian people.
The first EU evaluation mission under the Armenia-EU visa liberalization dialogue is in Yerevan to assess progress on the action plan presented to Armenia in early November. Talks focused on first phase benchmarks, and this includes legislation, sectoral policy, and the need for comprehensive workable reform documents. Armenian officials noted that several key strategies are still being finalized. The mission also met with Migration and Citizenship Service to review reforms in biometric systems, because Armenia still does not have biometric passports, right?
We had, but then we didn't
Then
have.
we didn't have, anyway. Data protection, border management, asylum and migration governance. At the investigative committee, discussions centered on international cooperation, legislative changes, and institutional capacity. EU representatives stressed the importance of Armenia's efforts to combat organized crime, terrorism, and corruption. The European Commission's first assessment report on Armenia's action plan is expected ahead of the European Political Community Summit that will take place in Yerevan in May.
And this has become a constant in all of our lives,
Yes,
and especially in the Week in Review, relations between state and church. This week, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan publicly proposed a roadmap for church reforms, while senior clergy remained divided over the leadership of Catholicos Garegin II. Pashinyan published what he described as a roadmap for the renewal of the Armenian Apostolic Holy Church following the removal of the Catholicos. The proposal outlines a three-stage process: the election of an acting Catholicos in line with existing church rules, the adoption of a new church charter, and the subsequent election of a Catholicos under the charter. According to the Prime Minister, the charter should regulate clergy conduct, ensure financial transparency, formalize the church's non-political status, align church activity with Armenia's tax code, while the government promises to return the collected taxes to the church, and establish social guarantees for clergy, including access to pensions and health insurance. Pashinyan said the acting Catholicos' primary role would be to organize the adoption of the new charter, with the government providing consultative support if requested. Pashinyan also proposed that church choirs perform Armenia's national anthem before Sunday liturgy, arguing that the Armenian Apostolic Church was established by a state decision in 301 AD.
Okay, well, on December 7, marking the anniversary of the 1988 Spidak earthquake, Pashinyan attended a memorial service at Gyumri's Holy Mother of God Cathedral. The service was conducted by a priest from Yerevan's St. Sarkis Church. So the head of the Ararat diocese, which encompasses Yerevan, is among the archbishops calling for the resignation of the Catholicos. And on the eve of the service in Gyumri, the dioceses of Shirak and Gugark publicly expressed support for Catholicos Garekin II. The Mother See strongly condemned the holding of a mass across dioceses under what it described as the Prime Minister's leadership and law enforcement involvement, calling it a gross violation of church order and Armenian law. So again, just to make sure that it's clear, a priest from a church in Yerevan, St. Sarkis Church, traveled to Gyumri to deliver mass in the presence of the prime minister and other state officials, and the Echmiadzin says this is against their church regulations. It said the participation of bishops without the consent of diocesan primates constitutes a serious canonical breach, specifically referencing the service held in Gyumri. Meanwhile, the Mother See announced the postponement of the Assembly of Bishops, originally scheduled for December 10 to 12, citing what it described as repression against clergy, including arrests. 4 senior clergymen remain in custody. The assembly had been convened to address recent developments surrounding the church and internal church life. Archbishops calling for Garekin II's removal criticized the postponement, saying it denied them the opportunity to present their canonical position before the church's highest body.
And Archbishop Mikhail Azerbaijan's health has worsened in prison, and authorities have now approved his transfer to a hospital for surgery. His lawyer says a request for him to undergo surgery at his own expense was first submitted to the penitentiary service on October 7, and a second written request followed on October 29, yet the penitentiary medical center did not respond until November 28, claiming Azerbaijan had refused free surgery. The justice minister later dismissed the lawyer's request, saying they did not meet formal requirements. The defense rejected this, noting that for nearly 2 months, no official explained any procedural deficiencies, effectively delaying Azerbaijan's access to medical care. And just as a reminder, Azerbaijan, the head of the Shirak diocese, has been handed a 2-year prison sentence. He was convicted for publicly calling for actions aimed at seizing power, violating territorial integrity, or overthrowing the constitutional order.
And this week, 29 civil society organizations and individuals issued a joint statement expressing serious concern over recent developments in Armenia, warning of violations of the constitution, the rule of law, human rights, the independence of the judiciary, as well as what it described as a gross infringement of the autonomy of the Armenian Apostolic Church, a right protected under Armenia's constitution and international conventions. According to the signatories, representatives of the executive and legislative branches have interfered in the church's internal affairs, including its governance and decision-making processes, in violation of domestic law, international standards on freedom of religion, and the European Court of Human Rights case law. The group further condemned pressure allegedly exerted on clergy by law enforcement agencies, including the National Security Service, as well as the selective use of criminal justice measures, such as detention, to influence members of the clergy. The statement also criticizes inflammatory rhetoric by senior officials and the dissemination of private information about clergy, warning that such actions risk deepening polarization and undermining public cohesion. The signatories call on the Prime Minister and other officials to refrain from unconstitutional actions, urge President Vahagan Khachaturian to ensure constitutional compliance, and demand judicial independence, restraint by law enforcement, and equal application of the law.
Transparency International has also raised concerns over what it described as the blatant interference by senior representatives of the ruling party in the affairs of the Armenian Church, as well as the targeting and stigmatization of independent media outlets and journalists. In a statement marking International Anti-Corruption Day, the organization noted that Armenia's score in Transparency International's 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index remained unchanged at 47 points, the same as in 2023, indicating no progress in the fight against corruption over the past year. Public opinion data released in June of 2025 by the International Republican Institute shows that trust in key state institutions remains low, while infrastructure projects are seen as the most visible government achievement. Only 3% of respondents cited effective anti-corruption measures, and just 4% identified the failure to fight corruption as the authorities' biggest shortcoming, suggesting limited public engagement with anti-corruption efforts. A 2025 monitoring report by the OECD Anti-Corruption Network, which assesses performance across CIS countries, acknowledges progress in evaluating Armenia's reforms, but highlights serious problems with their implementation. With parliamentary and local elections scheduled for 2026, Transparency International stresses that ensuring free, fair, and transparent elections must be a top priority. It highlights major risks related to party financing transparency, unregulated third-party involvement in campaigns, abuse of administrative resources, and the lack of accountability in cases linked to the ruling party.
Well, it was quite a week, and as always, we talk about the articles that we published. And today we published one by Hovannes Nazaretian called System Failure, Draining Strategic Aquifers for Short-Term Profit. And based on that, we did another segment of our video explainers called It Has to Be Said. And it's basically about Armenia's Ararat Artesian Basin, which is the country's second most important freshwater reserve after Lake Sevan, and how it's being drained faster than it can replenish.
And because we want to export fish, which is the most ridiculous part of this whole situation.
Country,
and because the businesses that want to export fish don't want to be responsible in using the water because...
Yeah, and we reported on this years ago. Do you remember?
It was one of our very first
articles that we did about how they were, drilling deep into the aquifer, and they were just using it and then dumping the water. It was just a ridiculous thing. And
because in 2017, there were cases where some villages and houses in some villages in the area were collapsing because the earth underneath them, there were vacuums underneath them. Well, the situation hasn't been fixed. And what is water? Just nothing in today's world.
Yeah.
Well, we have an etc. piece this week. It's a film critique or
a
review. Caucasian Blues, a collaboration that couldn't find its voice. It's by Talin Unjan. She speaks about a long-awaited South Caucasian co-production that promised hope through collaboration. The film is called Caucasian Blues, and it has struggled with stereotypes, weak writing, and shallow politics. Unjan says it reveals how difficult genuine, transformative regional storytelling is.
Yeah, she was quite... what's the word?
Disappointed.
Yeah, it was very clear.
Well, we didn't mention it's like Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan collaboration, and the main characters are from these countries who meet in Tbilisi.
Of course, it's always Tbilisi. Well, another piece that we have, it's called, interestingly, The Queen, Armenia's Forests and Bureaucratic Hurdles. Our Haranush Dermoyan went to a tree planting and with Queen Mathilde of Belgium, who was visiting the country, and it was a royal visit that was to spotlight and did Armenia's forests, but it also exposed how bureaucracy, competing land interests, and weak governance continue to undermine reforestation in the country. And as Armenia prepares for COP17 next year, ambitious pledges collide with stalled permits, mining pressures, and a system struggling to turn promises into forests.
And another story, we published an article, an investigation of sorts, should I say.
Yeah, it's an OSINT piece. And
yes.
I struggled with it a bit.
Yes. Because it looks at Russia's war in Ukraine and how, as it drags on, there are allegations that some are founded, some are not so founded, that troops and resources have quietly been redeployed from Armenia's Gyumri base and the former peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh. Justin Tomczyk explains online activity that reveals this movement of forces and what a planned surge of troops to Gyumri means for the region.
And interestingly, we had been talking about this, right, Rubina? How many Russian troops are really on Armenian soil, and
particularly in Gyumri?
In Gyumri at the 102nd base. So this is an interesting piece. I was dragging my foot on it
because there's no way of knowing for sure how many and what's happening, because these are closed systems. But what Justin did is infiltrate through, or look through social media, some posts.
He did a phenomenal job.
Yes,
Indeed. We're just
finding
extra
just
careful.
little indications of what kind of movements might have happened.
And as we spoke about, Armenia signed a strategic partnership agenda with the EU. So our Nerses Kopalyan wrote a piece called Security Dimensions of the EU-Armenia Strategic Agenda, because it's not only economic and political, there's the security component incorporates Europe as an important part of Armenia's developing security architecture, where the confluence of hard power capacity and small state resilience become integrated at the institutional level with European and transatlantic standards.
And we have an English
podcast
from Vigen Galastyan from his But and Yet Still by Tevsakan Anwame Nainiv series. But he's been kind of recently going bilingual with the podcast, so every once in a while we have an English version. This time his guest was an Italian photographer in Armenia.
And that's the kind of week it's been here in Armenia. Thank you for listening. Have a safe and peaceful weekend, and we'll be back again next week.